7 daughters, all pregnant at the same time, all carrying their own father's children. This is the story of one of the most horrifying cases of family abuse in American history, and what it reveals about power, silence, and how systems fail the most vulnerable. The year was 1854 in rural Texas, in a region that was still considered frontier territory. The family lived on an isolated ranch, miles from the nearest neighbors, far from the oversight of law or community. The father, a man we'll call Jacob Wilson, had moved his family to this remote location deliberately. He told people it was for the independence, for the freedom to live as he chose. But isolation served another purpose. It hid what was happening inside his household from any eyes that might have questioned, that might have intervened, that might have stopped him. Jacob Wilson had 7 daughters ranging in age from 13 to 24. Their mother had died 3 years earlier, leaving the girls with no protector, no advocate, no one to stand between them and their father. From the moment their mother died, Jacob began a campaign of systematic abuse against all 7 daughters. What he did to them was not sudden or impulsive. It was deliberate, calculated, sustained. And by 1854, all 7 daughters were pregnant, all at the same time, all carrying children fathered by the man who was supposed to protect them. This case forces us to confront the darkest possibilities of human cruelty. It shows us what can happen when someone has absolute power over others, when that power is unchecked by law or community, when victims have no means of escape or protection. It reveals how isolation enables abuse, how patriarchal authority can become tyrannical control, and how systems designed to protect families can fail catastrophically when the threat comes from within the family itself. Before we examine the specific details of this case, we need to understand the context of 1850s Texas. This was a time and place where fathers had nearly absolute legal authority over their children. Women and children were considered property of the male head of household. A father's word was law within his family. Outside interference in family matters was rare and often unwelcome. The doctrine of parental rights and family privacy meant that what happened inside a home was considered private, even when what was happening was criminal. In rural frontier areas like where the Wilson family lived, formal law enforcement was minimal or non-existent. There were no police departments, no social services, no mandatory reporting of abuse. Communities were spread out, and people minded their own business. This combination of legal authority, social isolation, and a lack of institutional oversight created conditions where abuse could flourish unchecked. Jacob Wilson was in his late 40s when his wife died. By all accounts from those who knew him casually, he seemed like a respectable rancher, stern perhaps, but not unusually so for the time. He kept his family isolated, but that wasn't uncommon in rural Texas. He was known to be strict with his daughters, but strict fathers were the norm in the 19th century. Nothing about his public presentation suggested the monster. He was in private. The daughters were named Sarah, Mary, Elizabeth, Rebecca, Rachel, Ruth, and Hannah, ranging from 13 to 24 years old. Before their mother's death, they had been typical frontier girls, working hard on the ranch, receiving minimal education, preparing for the marriages their father would eventually arrange for them. Their mother, while constrained by the patriarchal norms of the time, had provided some buffer between the girls and their father's harshness. When their mother died in 1851, the family's dynamics shifted dramatically. Jacob began asserting control in new and disturbing ways. He forbade the girls from leaving the ranch without his permission, which he rarely granted. He prevented them from attending the few social gatherings that occurred in the area. He refused to allow visitors to the house. He monitored their conversations, their activities, their every movement. The isolation that had been a matter of geography became enforced isolation, a deliberate strategy to prevent the girls from forming relationships or connections that might provide them with protection or escape routes. The abuse began gradually with the oldest daughter, Sarah, and then extended to each of the others as they reached what Jacob considered sufficient maturity. The pattern was similar for each girl. Jacob would begin with verbal abuse and intimidation, establishing psychological dominance. He would tell them that he owned them, that they had no rights, that no one would believe them if they told, that they owed him obedience in all things. Then he would escalate to physical violence, hitting them for any perceived disobedience. And finally, He would commit acts of intimate violence that we now recognize as incestuous abuse. For the daughters, the abuse created a psychological prison as confining as any physical cell. They were trapped on an isolated ranch with no means of transportation, no money, no connections to the outside world. They had been taught from birth that fathers had absolute authority, that children owed complete obedience. They had been told by their abuser that no one would help them, that speaking out would only bring more punishment, that resistance was futile. And they had no reason to believe otherwise. They had no evidence that help was available or that anyone would believe them over their father. The sisters turned to each other for support, creating a network of mutual care and survival within their captivity. The older sisters tried to protect the younger ones, though their ability to do so was limited. They shared information about how to avoid triggering their father's rage, how to endure when abuse was unavoidable, how to find small moments of peace or normalcy in a nightmare existence. This solidarity among the sisters was crucial to their survival, but it also meant they all knew what was happening to each of them, creating collective trauma. By 1854, 3 years into this systematic abuse, all 7 daughters found themselves pregnant at the same time. This was not coincidence. Jacob had been regularly forcing himself on all 7 daughters. The simultaneous pregnancies represented the horrifying scale of his crimes. He had not only violated his daughters, but had done so repeatedly, and to all of them. The pregnancies were physical evidence of sustained, systematic abuse. When the pregnancies became visible, Jacob faced a problem. Pregnant daughters would eventually raise questions from the few neighbors or traveling merchants who occasionally passed through the area. People would ask about the fathers of the babies. Even in the patriarchal culture of 1850s, Texas, 7 unmarried daughters, all pregnant at once, would cause talk. Jacob needed a story. He concocted an elaborate lie. He told neighbors that the girls had been visited by traveling ranch hands over the past months while he had been away on cattle drives. He portrayed his daughters as promiscuous and shameful, as having brought disgrace on the family. This narrative served multiple purposes. It provided an explanation for the pregnancies. It preemptively discredited the daughters by portraying them as immoral, and it positioned him as the wronged father dealing with wayward children. This strategy of blaming victims and discrediting them in advance is common among abusers. By controlling the narrative, by telling his story before the daughters could tell theirs, Jacob made it less likely that anyone would believe the girls if they ever tried to reveal the truth. He was using social stigma against premarital pregnancy to silence his victims. But one of the daughters, Mary, who was 21 years old and pregnant with what would be her second child by her father, had reached a breaking point. The prospect of bearing another child, conceived through her father's violence, the knowledge that all her sisters were suffering the same fate, the recognition that this cycle would never end unless someone intervened. All of this drove Mary to take an enormous risk. During one of the rare occasions when Jacob left the ranch to go to town for supplies, Mary walked to the nearest neighboring ranch about 7 miles away. She was visibly pregnant, exhausted from the walk, terrified of what her father would do if he discovered her absence. But she was desperate. She knocked on the door of the neighboring ranch and asked to speak to the woman of the house. The neighbor, a woman we'll call Mrs. Patterson, was initially suspicious. She knew of the Wilson family and had heard Jacob's story about his daughter's supposed promiscuity. She assumed Mary had come to ask for charity or help with her pregnancy. But Mary, speaking quickly because she knew she had limited time, told Mrs. Patterson the truth. She explained that she and all her sisters were pregnant by their father. She described years of abuse. She begged for help. Mrs. Patterson's initial reaction was disbelief. The accusation was so extreme, so horrifying, that it seemed impossible. Surely no father would do such things to his own daughters. But as Mary continued talking, providing details that couldn't have been fabricated, showing marks on her body from beatings, describing specific incidents with the unmistakable authenticity of lived experience, Mrs. Patterson began to believe. Mrs. Patterson faced a difficult decision. In 1854 Texas, formal mechanisms for reporting abuse barely existed. There was no hotline to call, no social services to contact, no clear legal process for removing children from dangerous homes. Moreover, accusing a man of incestuous abuse of his daughters was explosive. If the accusation was believed, Jacob would face severe punishment, possibly death. If the accusation wasn't believed, Mary would be branded a liar and a slanderer, and Jacob would likely retaliate against her and her sisters. Mrs. Patterson decided to act. She told Mary to stay at her house, refusing to let her return to her father. She sent her husband to gather other neighboring ranchers and to fetch the nearest circuit judge, who happened to be in a town about 30 miles away. Word spread quickly through the sparse frontier community. The accusation was so shocking that people had to see for themselves whether it could possibly be true. Within 2 days, a group had assembled at the Patterson Ranch. The circuit judge, several neighboring ranchers, the local minister, and a few other community leaders. They interviewed Mary, hearing her account in detail. Then they decided they needed to investigate the Wilson Ranch and interview the other daughters. When the group arrived at the Wilson Ranch, Jacob was furious. He viewed this as an invasion of his property and his privacy. He invoked his rights as a father, his authority over his household, his right to be free from interference. He called Mary a liar and a troublemaker. He insisted that the neighbors leave his property immediately. But the group included the circuit judge, who had legal authority that even Jacob had to acknowledge. The judge ordered Jacob to allow the group to speak with the other 6 daughters, separately and out of Jacob's presence. Jacob resisted, but ultimately had no choice when faced with the armed ranchers who had accompanied the judge. The other 6 daughters were interviewed one by one. Initially, most were too frightened to speak honestly. Years of intimidation and isolation had taught them that defying their father led only to punishment. But when they learned that Mary had already told the truth and was safe, and when they saw that there were people who were willing to listen and potentially help, several began to confirm Mary's account. Sarah, the oldest at 24, and Elizabeth, aged 20, both corroborated the abuse. The younger girls, Rebecca at 18, Rachel at 16, Ruth at 15, and Hannah at 13, were more reluctant, but their fear and their visible pregnancies spoke volumes. The physical evidence was overwhelming. 7 daughters, all pregnant at the same time, all living in isolation with only their father. Jacob's explanation that they had all been with traveling ranch hands was implausible on its face. The daughters' testimonies, even though some were reluctant or incomplete due to fear, established a consistent pattern of abuse. The judge, horrified by what he was hearing, made the decision to remove the daughters from Jacob's custody immediately and to arrest Jacob pending a formal trial. Jacob was taken into custody and transported to the nearest jail, about 30 miles away. The 7 daughters were taken to various neighboring ranches where families agreed to house them temporarily. This separation from each other was difficult for the sisters. But it was deemed necessary both for practical reasons — no one household could easily accommodate 7 pregnant women — and to prevent Jacob from potentially accessing them if he somehow escaped or made bail. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational cases in Texas history. The courtroom was packed with people who had traveled significant distances to witness it. Newspapers sent reporters. The case attracted attention not just because of the horrific nature of the crimes, but because it challenged fundamental assumptions about family, authority, and the limits of paternal power. Jacob's defense attorney argued that the accusations were lies concocted by ungrateful daughters who resented their father's discipline. He argued that the pregnancies could indeed have resulted from encounters with ranch hands or other men, despite the lack of any evidence for this. He argued that daughters couldn't be allowed to make accusations against their fathers without corroborating evidence, or else any rebellious child could destroy a father's reputation with false claims. But the prosecution had devastating evidence. Multiple daughters testified about the abuse, providing details that corroborated each other's accounts. Medical testimony established that the pregnancies were all at similar stages, suggesting they had occurred during a period when the daughters had been kept in complete isolation with only their father present. Neighbors testified that they had never seen the supposed ranch hands that Jacob claimed had visited the daughters. Mrs. Patterson testified about Mary's desperate plea for help. Perhaps most damning was Jacob's own demeanor in court. Rather than showing horror at the accusations or grief at being falsely accused by his daughters, he showed rage and entitlement. He ranted about his rights as a father, about how his daughters belonged to him, about how no one had the authority to interfere with his family. His words revealed an attitude of ownership and control, that suggested the capacity for exactly the crimes he was accused of. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on multiple counts of incestuous abuse. The judge, in sentencing, called the case the most depraved and monstrous abuse of parental authority he had ever encountered. Jacob Wilson was sentenced to death by hanging, the standard punishment for such crimes in 1850s Texas. The execution was carried out several months later. Jacob never expressed remorse. He maintained to the end that he had been wronged, that his daughters had betrayed him, that the community had violated his rights as a father. His inability to recognize the humanity of his daughters or the evil of his actions was chilling. He had so thoroughly internalized a worldview where children were property and fathers were absolute authorities that he genuinely seemed to believe he had done nothing wrong. For the 7 daughters, the trial and execution brought both relief and new challenges. They were free from their abuser, but they were also pregnant with children conceived through abuse. They were facing social stigma despite being victims, and they had to find ways to rebuild lives that had been shattered by years of trauma. The pregnancies came to term over the following months. All 7 daughters gave birth, producing 7 babies who were both their children and their half-siblings, biological paradoxes that reflected the twisted circumstances of their conception. The daughters faced difficult decisions about these babies. Some chose to keep and raise them, finding that their love for the children transcended the horrific circumstances of conception. Others chose to place the babies for adoption through churches or charitable organizations. There was no good choice. Keeping the children meant constant reminders of trauma, but giving them up meant losing children they might have bonded with. Each daughter made the choice that seemed least unbearable to her. The community's response to the daughters was mixed. Some people were sympathetic, recognizing them as victims who had suffered unimaginable abuse. These people offered support, housing, and assistance. But others were judgmental, viewing the daughters as somehow tainted or complicit in their own abuse. The stigma attached to premarital pregnancy, combined with the disturbing nature of the incestuous abuse, made some people uncomfortable around the daughters, as if their victimization made them improper or shameful. This victim-blaming response was unjust, but not surprising. Throughout history, survivors of abuse, particularly intimate abuse, have often faced social stigma and blame. People want to believe that such things don't happen, or if they do happen, that the victims must have done something to cause or deserve it. This psychological defensiveness protects people from confronting the disturbing reality that abuse can happen to anyone, that it's perpetrated by seemingly ordinary people, that the world is less safe and predictable than we want to believe. The sisters stayed in contact with each other throughout their lives, maintaining the bonds that had helped them survive years of abuse. They understood each other in ways that no one else could. They didn't have to explain their trauma or justify their choices or prove their victimization. They could simply exist together with full understanding. This continued connection was crucial to their long-term healing. Some of the daughters eventually married. Others chose to remain single, either because they couldn't overcome the trauma sufficiently to trust men in intimate relationships, or because they preferred independence after years of male tyranny. Those who married generally chose men who were kind and gentle, who respected their autonomy, who understood that these women needed patience and tenderness. Some of these marriages were successful and provided healing. Others foundered because the trauma was too deep. The daughters who kept their babies faced unique challenges. They had to explain to their children, eventually, the circumstances of their birth. Some chose to tell the truth when the children were old enough to understand. Others created cover stories, claiming the fathers had died or disappeared. Each approach had costs. The truth was traumatic to share and to hear. But lies created distance and secrets that could damage the mother-child relationship. The children themselves, those born from abuse, had their own struggles. Some grew up not knowing their true origins and were eventually shocked to learn the truth. Others grew up knowing and had to process the knowledge that they were products of abuse, that their grandfather was also their father, that their very existence was evidence of a crime. These children faced identity challenges, questions about what their origins meant for who they were, fears about genetic problems that might result from incest. Medical science in the 1850s didn't understand genetics the way we do now, But people knew that children born from close blood relationships often had health problems. Some of the 7 babies born to the Wilson daughters did have congenital issues, developmental delays, physical abnormalities, health problems. Whether these were caused by the incestuous conception or were random variations that occur in any population is impossible to determine retrospectively. But the daughters who saw their children suffer health problems had to wonder if those problems were somehow their fault, even though, rationally, they knew they were victims who bore no responsibility for their father's crimes. Let's examine the broader implications of this case for understanding family violence and systemic failures. The Wilson case demonstrates how isolation enables abuse. Jacob deliberately kept his daughters isolated from community, from potential supporters, from anyone who might have questioned his treatment of them. This isolation meant the abuse could continue for years without intervention. It's a pattern we see repeatedly in family violence cases. Abusers isolate their victims to maintain control and prevent discovery. The case also reveals the dangers of unlimited parental authority. In 1850s America, fathers had enormous legal power over their children. This power was generally justified through appeals to natural law, religious doctrine, and social order. Fathers were supposed to be benevolent authorities who acted in their children's best interests. But when a father was malevolent rather than benevolent, when he used his authority to harm rather than protect, children had few legal recourses. The Wilson case helped demonstrate the need for limits on parental power, for recognition that children have rights that must be protected even against their own parents. The case shows the importance of believing victims. Multiple people had opportunities to learn about the abuse earlier if they had been willing to listen to or believe the daughters. But the daughters had been silenced by fear, by shame, by reasonable expectations that they wouldn't be believed. When Mary finally spoke to Mrs. Patterson, her willingness to listen and believe was crucial. If Mrs. Patterson had dismissed Mary's account or had decided it was none of her business, the abuse would have continued. This highlights the ongoing challenge of disclosure. Victims of family violence, particularly intimate abuse by parents, face enormous barriers to disclosure. They may be physically prevented from seeking help. They may fear retaliation. They may worry they won't be believed. They may feel shame, even though the shame should belong only to the perpetrator. They may have been psychologically manipulated into believing the abuse is normal or deserved. For every victim who manages to disclose, there are likely many others who remain silent, continuing to suffer in isolation. The case also demonstrates the failure of relying solely on informal community oversight. The frontier system where communities were supposed to self-regulate, where neighbors were supposed to look out for each other, failed the Wilson daughters for years. The isolation of frontier life, combined with cultural norms about family privacy and paternal authority, meant that serious abuse could occur without intervention. This suggests the need for formal institutional oversight, for mandatory reporting systems, for trained investigators who can identify and respond to abuse. Let's connect this historical case to contemporary issues. Incestuous abuse still occurs today, though it's difficult to know how common it is because it's so underreported. Current estimates suggest that between 1 and 5% of children experience some form of incestuous abuse, but the true numbers are likely higher. The vast majority of incestuous abuse is perpetrated by fathers, stepfathers, or other male relatives against daughters, though abuse of sons also occurs and is particularly underreported due to additional layers of stigma. The dynamics that enabled the Wilson case, isolation, power imbalance, victim silencing, still enable abuse today. While we no longer have the same frontier conditions or the same explicit legal framework giving fathers unlimited authority, we still have families living in isolation, religious or cultural communities that minimize outside intervention in families, and social norms that make it difficult for victims to disclose abuse. Modern child protection systems theoretically provide better safeguards than existed in 1854. We have mandatory reporting laws that require certain professionals to report suspected abuse. We have child protective services that can investigate allegations and remove children from dangerous homes. We have better legal protections for children and better recognition of children's rights. But these systems are far from perfect. They're underfunded, overwhelmed, and sometimes fail to protect children who need help. The phenomenon of multiple victims within one family is also unfortunately common in contemporary abuse cases. When an abuser has regular access to multiple potential victims and has successfully established control over a household, they often abuse multiple family members. Siblings in abusive households often discover later that they were all being abused, sometimes by keeping each other's abuse secret to protect one another from additional trauma. The psychological impacts of incestuous abuse are severe and long-lasting. Victims experience what's called complex trauma, trauma that's repeated over time, that occurs in relationships that should be safe and nurturing, that fundamentally disrupts development and sense of self. Symptoms can include depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, difficulty with relationships and trust, problems with intimacy, substance abuse as a form of self-medication, and sometimes suicidal ideation. Treatment typically requires long-term therapy focused on processing trauma, rebuilding a sense of safety and self-worth, and developing healthy relationship patterns. The children born from incestuous abuse face their own challenges. Beyond potential genetic issues, they face identity questions and social stigma. They may struggle with feelings about their origins and about the parent who was both victim and parent. They may have complicated relationships with other family members who remind them of the abuse. They may face difficult decisions about how much to reveal about their origins in their own lives and relationships. The legal system's response to incestuous abuse has evolved significantly since 1854. Today, incestuous abuse is a serious crime in all jurisdictions, often carrying long prison sentences. But prosecution remains challenging. Cases often come down to the victim's word against the perpetrators, and victims are frequently reluctant to testify against family members. Defense attorneys may attack victims' credibility. Juries may be reluctant to believe that parents could do such things to their own children. Conviction rates for incestuous abuse remain lower than for stranger abuse, despite the fact that family members are far more likely to be perpetrators. One positive development has been increased recognition of the impact of trauma on victims' ability to report promptly or consistently. Courts increasingly understand that delayed disclosure doesn't mean false accusation, that inconsistencies in accounts can result from trauma rather than dishonesty, that victims have valid reasons for initially denying abuse when asked directly. This understanding has made it somewhat easier to successfully prosecute cases even when disclosure is delayed. The role of non-offending family members is also crucial and complicated. In the Wilson case, the mother's death removed the one person who might have protected the daughters, or at least provided some buffer against their father's abuse. In contemporary cases, non-offending parents, usually mothers when fathers are the abusers, face difficult positions. Some are genuinely unaware of the abuse despite living in the same household. Others have suspicions but deny or minimize them. Still others know about the abuse but feel powerless to stop it, or are themselves being abused by the same perpetrator. The question of what non-offending parents should do when they learn about abuse is ethically clear. They should protect the child, report the abuse, and remove the child from contact with the abuser. But in practice, this is often complicated by economic dependence, fear of the abuser, concerns about family dissolution, and sometimes misguided beliefs that the abuse can be stopped without outside intervention. Child protection systems increasingly hold non-offending parents accountable for failure to protect, which is appropriate, but can also be complicated when those parents are themselves victims. Prevention of incestuous abuse requires multiple approaches. We need education about healthy sexuality and appropriate boundaries that helps children recognize abuse and know that they can report it. We need to reduce family isolation and increase connections to community and support systems. We need to challenge cultural and religious teachings that position fathers as absolute authorities or that prioritize family preservation over child safety. We need better screening by professionals who interact with families to identify warning signs. And we need to create environments where children feel safe disclosing abuse and confident they will be believed and protected. The Wilson case, despite its historical distance, remains relevant as the extreme example of what can happen when all protective factors fail. 7 daughters, all pregnant at the same time by their father, represents a complete systemic failure of community oversight, failure of legal protections, failure of every structure that should have protected these girls. Understanding this case helps us recognize the importance of multiple layers of protection, of not relying on any single safeguard. As we conclude this examination of one of history's most disturbing family abuse cases, we must remember the seven sisters: Sarah, Mary, Elizabeth, Rebecca, Rachel, Ruth, and Hannah. They survived years of abuse that should never have happened. They showed extraordinary courage in eventually speaking out. They rebuilt lives from wreckage. They were not defined by what was done to them, even though what was done to them was horrific. Their story is important not because we should dwell on the details of abuse, but because we must understand how abuse happens, what enables it, and how to prevent it. Every time we strengthen protections for children, every time we believe a victim, every time we intervene to stop abuse, we honor the memory of these sisters and all survivors of family violence. If you found this examination of a dark chapter in history meaningful, if it deepened your understanding of family violence and the failures that enable it, if it reinforced your commitment to protecting children and believing survivors, please subscribe to Sinister Past. We examine difficult histories not to sensationalize suffering, but to learn from the past's failures and to honor survivors' courage. The Wilson sisters' story is one that needed to be told, not for shock value, but for the important lessons it teaches about power, isolation, silence, and survival. Subscribe, share this video, and join us as we continue to explore history's difficult truths. Because remembering cases like this, learning from them, and working to prevent similar horrors is how we honor survivors and create a safer world.